Matthew Parks is Cosatu's Parliamentary Coordinator. He joins us now via Zoom to talk to us a little bit about this labour issue. Thank you so much for joining us. Welcome to the programme.
Sure. Well, thanks for having me, Peter. Good evening.
All right. So the EFF going out to various places of work and doing those inspections has become quite a controversial thing. What were your immediate thoughts when you saw this happening?
Look, as Cosatu and I think all the other trade unions were keen for political parties not to enter the workplace. The workplace is an environment by law between the employer and between workers, and that's why you have trade unions to deal with such issues. But look, I think what's most critical is that there are significant abuses taking place at many workplaces across many industries across the country. These range from workers not being paid at least at the level of minimum wage, the health and safety conditions not being adhered to, workers being forced to work overtime without overtime pay, workers being denied paid leave, many other abuses. So I think for us what's critical is that trade unions, number one, help to expose that. Workers should report these to the trade unions, to the Department of Labour. But equally what's also critical is for the Department of Labour to regularly deploy its inspectors to go out and visit all the workplaces to make sure they're in compliance with all the labour laws. So I think we're quite pleased that the Minister of Labour has gone out today and yesterday in Cape Town to visit workplaces. There's a positive start. Much more needs to be done. We've been waiting for this for quite some time as Cosatu. We were quite pleased in 2020, at the beginning of the lockdown of COVID-19, when the Department of Labour employed an additional 500 health and labour inspectors. That is quite a useful boost to their resource capacity. And we met again with the Minister of Labour this morning, and he committed to employing an additional 500 labour inspectors. I think that's really going to make a positive difference. But look, fundamentally what's also important is for workers to feel empowered to report this to the unions, to the department, but equally employers have to make sure they are always in full compliance with all the labour laws. This is not meant to be a burden to them. It's a benefit to them, because a safe workplace, workers who are treated with respect, whose rights are honoured, are productive workers. That is going to benefit the workplace. So we want to move beyond a hostile work environment, but we need the cooperation of employers. We need the support of the department. And of course, workers are eyes and ears on the ground to report such abuses to us.
All right. You've said quite a bit there. Let's unpack it bit by bit. Let's start with the workers in the workplace themselves. Are we saying that those that have no union representation are the ones that are being abused the most? Or are you saying that even where there are unions, there's still abuses taking place?
Look, abuses take place in all workplaces, whether they're unionized or not unionized. But we do find a heavy prevalence of abuses. The worst types of abuse and exploitation takes place where workers are not unionized. There's a very strong relationship to that. So you find that, for example, farm workers, most of whom are not unionized, really often work in very horrendous conditions, are paid very little. Their homes are in shocking conditions. You find restaurant waitresses, usually not unionized, very low levels, often again are abused, subject to sexual harassment, subject to working overtime without compensation, often not even being paid what they're due. So really there is a strong correlation. When workers are unionized, they're much better placed to defend themselves. Doesn't mean abuse won't happen, but they're much better placed to do that. And part of also the benefit of joining a trade union is that unions have education and training programs, so workers can be aware of their rights, they know how to report them, they have shop stewards to help liaise with the trade unions, to defend the workers, to lead them. They have organizers who can come and visit workplaces to help them deal with the issues as they come around. But there are abuses. So even the public service, which is heavily unionized, there are abuses of workers. Workers are sexually harassed. Workers are subject to unsafe conditions and so forth, discriminated against, etc. But really, the most abused workers will always be those who are not unionized.
So I'm thinking that even if these labour inspectors come, perhaps the things that they can fix is if the environment isn't safe, if health and safety issues are not dealt with. But let's say there is sexual harassment and things like that. It must be difficult for those workers to tell those labour inspectors that actually there are problems. How do we get over that?
No, and the most difficult thing, Peter, why there's such a fear amongst many workers to report issues is because you have an unemployment rate of 46%. So workers are scared of losing their jobs. few jobs available. They're scared of losing the wages because they must go home and take care of their children, their parents, etc. So it really is a difficult scenario. If unemployment was at 5%, for example, you might find workers having a better space to report abuse and not being so fearful of very scarce jobs. But equally, workers can report issues anonymously to trade unions. They can report issues anonymously to the labour inspectors of the department. And the labour inspectors of the department are empowered fully by law to issue compliance orders to the employers. So the employer is obligated to implement those instructions. They're empowered to fine the employers. And for more serious and even criminal offences, there can be criminal prosecution as well. So sexual harassment, abuse of women workers physically, those are criminal offences and they can be dealt with accordingly. But look, it's a difficult thing. And I think that one of the most critical tools really is for us to increase the levels of trade union membership across the country, for us to make sure workers are organised, because that is really critical to empowering them to deal with such issues.
How prevalent is the presence of undocumented people in the workplace? Because I guess that they are the most exploited because they absolutely have nowhere to go.
It's a huge problem, and it's really risen in the last 2 decades. You can see it massively. There's a large amount of undocumented workers in agriculture, domestic work, gardeners, in the restaurants, in the hospitality sector, construction sector, the fuel industry, increasingly. Uber drivers. It really is a ticking time bomb because on the one hand, you have a 46% unemployment rate in South Africa, much higher for young township youth. You have a huge flood of migration to the country, so it really is a ticking time bomb. And we've seen every now and then when xenophobic violence has erupted, and that's going to continue to happen if you don't get a handle of the situation. We need to find the right balance. You can't go the xenophobic route. We must appreciate the difficulties that people from Zimbabwe, for example, who are fleeing an economic collapse of that country, people from Somalia who are fleeing a country which has been in civil war for 3 decades, are facing. But at the same time, it's not sustainable for South Africa to absorb such large amounts of migrant workers. South Africa can never create enough jobs to accommodate everybody. So there has to be a right balance. We need to see government enforcing the laws. And the laws are quite clear in terms of the requirements to get a work permit, into the scarce skill requirements for that work permit to be issued. But you find many employers are ignoring those labor laws. They're employing migrant workers who are not documented because they know those migrant workers are desperate. They will take any wage. They will not report any abuse. They will not unionize out of fear, out of desperation. And that really is causing a huge problem. It's suppressing the wage demand across the economy. And it's not something which is sustainable. We think government really needs to act on it quite swiftly. Employers, and including employer organizations, Business Unity South Africa, need to show leadership and help crack down on it. But if we don't do it, if we fail to do it, we're going to see the kind of violence we have seen in KZN, where truck drivers have rebelled, have blockaded roads because they cannot afford to see their jobs being lost because employers are looking for shortcuts to exploit undocumented migrant workers. But I think lastly, Peter, it's also important to remember that about 6 years ago, the Labour Relations Act was amended so that all workers, whether they are South African, whether they are documented migrant or undocumented migrant, they all are entitled to labour protections and they're all entitled not to being abused or exploited. But again, that's in paper, but in reality, many workers who are desperate from other countries will take any work they can get.
Why are these employers taking chances? Is it because there's not enough sanctions, not enough checking? Why are they able to take these chances and employ people who are undocumented and treat them badly?
Sure. Look, I mean, employers are looking for profit, and there's profit at all costs, irrespective of what is the damage to the fabric of society. They're able to get away with it because the capacity of government is very weak, it's very limited. Until 2020, the Department of Labour had only 1,200 labour inspectors, and yet we have about, almost 10 million workplaces across the economy. So it's very difficult for that small amount of labour inspectors to go and inspect so many workplaces. It's positive that the Department of Labour has increased, almost doubled the amount of labour inspectors, but that still is a drop in the ocean. We really need to see us having at least about 10,000 labour inspectors to begin to make a dent. And of course, the fact that only about 30% of workers belong to trade unions also creates a huge issue. And of course, it's much worse amongst these sectors where undocumented migrant workers historically don't join trade unions for obvious reasons. So You have a combination of factors, and that really is a huge problem. But on the other hand, we have a 46% unemployment rate, and South Africans are desperate for jobs. And there's a feeling of resentment that we have unemployment levels, in fact, above 50% in townships, yet jobs which should be easily able to absorb young township unemployed persons being used to hire undocumented migrant workers from other countries.
So in the formal workplace, perhaps that might be more manageable in terms of how you approach trying to root out these practices. But it starts to become much harder in the informal sector where businesses are not even registered. Domestic workers are employed by a single person. How do we manage these other areas where often, if I'm undocumented, those are the areas that I will start with?
No, it's a difficult thing. And you're right, the formal sector is much easier because formal companies, the supermarkets, registered companies which pay tax, abide by the laws. For them, they rather comply with the labor laws because it's not worth their inconvenience to break the laws. So they comply, it's much easier to enforce, etc. They pay income tax for the workers straight to SARS, so there's a easy enforcement capacity there. And I think you're right. You recall, Peter, that many years ago in Thabo Mbeki, the then president, said in South Africa we really have two nations, and this is what we're seeing. You have a large informal sector of the economy where there's very little enforcement of the laws, be it the Unemployment Insurance Fund, the Compensation of Injury on Duty Fund, the Labour Relations, the Basic Conditions of Employment Act, all ignored, and you're now seeing a free-for-all in effect. You're seeing very little enforcement by labour inspectors, by Home Affairs, by the police, and that really is creating a huge crisis. It's unsustainable. I think we've also seen over the past decade of state capture and corruption, how the capacity of the state was deliberately hollowed out and it's had a huge spillover effect across the state where government departments struggle to enforce basic laws. And again, because of corruption, badly needed revenue, which should have been gone to hire labor inspectors, to hire health inspectors, to hire police officers, Home Affairs officials to enforce the laws, has been held back because government is running out of money, because we bleed so much to corruption and wasteful expenditure all the time. So it really is a huge problem. It requires decisive political will to enforce the law, to rebuild a culture of adherence to the law across all of South Africa. And I think also to deal with the underlying economic issues. I think lastly, the one difficult thing, Peter, though, is South Africa can build a wall, can build a border, can enforce laws. It's very difficult, though, to manage migration from other countries until we can get the political and economic situation in Zimbabwe sorted out, until we can sort out the crisis in Somalia, until we can address the economic crisis in Congo, Nigeria, etc. We're going to continue to have a flood of migration to South Africa because it's seen as a well-developed economy in the continent. So we really need to have a joint approach when South Africa addresses its capacity issues, but equally we see the development of the Southern African region, of the entire African continent. So people don't see a need to flee their villages, their countries, their provinces to come to South Africa, but in fact they can find jobs, be it in Mozambique, be it Angola, Congo, etc.
Matthew, we're going to have to leave it there, but thanks very much indeed for joining us. And I guess, yes, laws must be enforced. We need more labour inspectors, but probably we need a shift in mindset so that people start to be law-abiding citizens and treat people humanely. I suppose that's really where we're going to win. Matthew, thanks so much indeed for joining us.
Thank you.
All right, that's Matthew Parks, Cosatu's Parliamentary Coordinator, joining us via Zoom to talk about these labour laws that are being flouted, but more inspectors have been put on the ground in a bid to try and deal with that issue.